2.5 Admins, episode 249. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary article plug, Alan, is what we've learned supporting FreeBSD in production, so you don't have to.
Yeah, so in this article, we talk about some practical applications for using FreeBSD in production and how to make that job easier, and some of the advantages to doing it right. Deploying things like boot environments, deciding on upgrade cadence, and all the other things that go into not only getting FreeBSD up and running, but keeping it running for many years.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. O2 Voice over LTE, locating any customer with a phone call.
This is really ugly. The very short version is a bug in the way that this service encoded metadata in their call records made it possible for a sufficiently knowledgeable attacker to call somebody and simply, because they had called that person, find what the current physical location of that person's phone was.
Yeah, and depending on how built up the area they were in would depend on the granularity and the accuracy of that. But if they were in a major city, it could be pretty accurate.
I don't even know that anywhere around where I live is somewhere that a Londoner would call a major city. But, you know, even in the vicinity of Columbia, South Carolina, I would generally expect a location within half a mile at worst. I mean, cell towers are placed pretty frequently unless you're far out into the sticks. So ultimately, this is obviously kind of a privacy nightmare. You know, we've seen similar issues with, like dating applications that disclosed people's, current location in ways they shouldn't have. In this particular case, because it's a concern with the way that the service reports the metadata, it reminds me more than anything else of people who don't understand JPEG metadata before they submit excessively spicy pictures, let's say, to services that they expect to be somewhat anonymous. You always know that, you are putting your own information out there, and there's something in the way of an information trail that leads to you, but people don't always know what all those bits of information are. And just like in a JPEG metadata, if you're not aware of it, your camera may very well have recorded exactly where you were on the planet when you took that picture of your backyard after you updated the garden or whatever it was that you wanted to show people. And in this case, every call that your phone received, the part of the connection exposed that location. So somebody who knew that you were on O2 and was aware of the flaw could exploit that to find out where you were at any given time, much like you'd installed, you'd given them permissions on like a Google Find My Phone or whatever the iOS equivalent is.
And so basically in one of the SIP headers for the voice over IP, it basically has the unique ID of the cell tower that they were nearest. And so by taking that information that you can get with, in this case, the researcher was using an Android tool called Network Signal Guru, but effectively, it's Wireshark for your phone. And by looking at the SIP packet, they could see the specific cell ID, and then putting that into cellmapper.net, you'd get basically a Google Maps thing showing you, okay, they were near this cell tower. And so if you can call someone a couple of times and triangulate, suddenly you can know within probably a reasonable number of feet where exactly that person is. And even if they move, be able to continue to see where they are.
Another maybe useful way to think about this information that's being disclosed, this is literally the data that the police would be looking for if they subpoena the phone company to look for your records because they wanted to find out where you were on the night of the crime, yada, yada, yada. This is the exact metadata they would be looking for after a subpoena, but it was being exposed literally just every time somebody called you.
Yeah, and this researcher, Daniel Williams, did responsibly disclose it, and O2 did nothing until this blog post came out, and there was a big public stink about it.
Isn't it funny how things seem to keep going that way? The responsible disclosure happens, crickets chirp, and then all of a sudden the outrage brigade makes enough noise, and hey, how about that? We got a patch.
But I think what was interesting there is just the example you had of, if you go to British Telecom's website, they actually have under the Contact BT a responsible disclosure section where it explains how to reach their security team, and O2, they're like, well, you can email security incidents at virginmedia02.co.uk, but nobody will read that.
Yeah, and O2 is a massive network here in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And this didn't require specialist equipment. It was, I think, a Pixel 9 that was rooted, or a Pixel 8 or something.
Yeah, and basically an Android version of something like Wireshark. It is nothing special at all.
Ending TLS client authentication certificate support in 2026. This is a post from Let's Encrypt about something I didn't even know existed, I have to admit.
Yeah, so when you request a new certificate from Let's Encrypt today, it gives you a server certificate, but that server certificate has the EKU, or extended key usage setting, that says other things that certificate can be used for. And one of those is TLS client authentication, which is not something people typically use, right? In most cases, a TLS certificate is used by a server to prove to a client, like your web browser, that this is actually the website you're trying to reach, like your bank or something, right? Where a certificate authority has verified that the website you're going to is the holder of that certificate, and that it allows that website to prove it is who it says it is before you try to log in and so on. But a TLS client certificate does the opposite. It actually allows your browser to prove that you are a certain person and prove that to the server. And that's not very commonly used, but it was something that was enabled by default in Let's Encrypt, and they're going to be phasing that out now. This change was prompted by Google Chrome's root program requirements, which says that by June 2026, client and server authentication have to be separate entire public key infrastructures. Many uses of client authentication are better served by private certificate authorities, and so Let's Encrypt is discontinuing support for client certificates altogether, but they have a very nice phase-out program described on their website where you'll be able to keep having it for a little while if you need it, but the default is going to be switching off ahead of this deadline from, well, in this case, Google Chrome, but I'm guessing it'll become a CAB default pretty soon.
Do we know why Google wants the hard separation between being able to use a certificate as both server and client this way?
Not really. I'm guessing partly because the user needs to be able to edit the list of client certificates, but maybe they don't want your phone to ever be able to change the list of certificates or something. I'm not sure. Or just there's been some attack where somebody managed to confuse a client for a server certificate or something and enabled something. I don't know.
It'd be interesting to pin down exactly why that call got made. One of the things that I find interesting about that is the round of all the news sites, including us, lead with this as a story about what Let's Encrypt did. But, then you dig a little bit further and it's like, well, they're just doing what Google says they have to do, actually, which brings us back to, a perennial topic on this and lots of shows, which is just kind of like how much reach does Google really have in terms of being able to kind of single-handedly determine the way the web works?
A lot.
Yeah. I was actually a little surprised to read that this is part of Google Chrome's root program requirements and not the CA/B, which is the Certificate Authority Browser Consortium that kind of sets the rules. For example, we saw via that group, Apple pushing for certificates that don't last more than, 45 days or something.
Right.
But Google doesn't seem to be taking that path to force this change through. They're just saying, if you want to be a supported CA in Google Chrome, you have to do this. And it is interesting to see that they didn't go the route everybody else has traditionally gone of doing that through the CAB. Maybe after June 2026, once these are deprecated, Google will tell us what the attack was that prompted this.
And who knows, maybe after one or another of the current antitrust suits get a little further, maybe Google will get a little bit more interested in going through proper authorities rather than just taking the 900-pound gorilla route when they'd like to see a change.
Or whoever else ends up owning Chrome. I don't know.
We can dream, right?
Yeah, once OpenAI owns it, it'll all be fine.
I say dream. Ressington has to make it a nightmare. That'll be enough.
VPN firm says it didn't know customers had lifetime subscriptions, cancels them.
Citi says it has no idea man was selling its bridge. News at 11. All these lifetime subscriptions, I don't know how many times we can keep warning folks that there is no such thing as a permanent subscription, a lifetime subscription. If it is a thing that a company has to continue doing something on their end to provide you that thing, the money that you gave them 20 years ago, it's just not going to keep giving you what you want forever. That's not how this works. And I would like to remind some folks of a statistic that I believe I've dropped on an earlier episode of this show, which is the average lifespan of a company on the Standard & Poor's 500, which is, the 500 largest, most well-established firms. And the average lifespan as of 2020 of a company on the S&P 500 is only 17 years. That's from the date it's incorporated to the date it's gone, folks.
And that's the average, so that means half of them are less than that.
And that's the average on the S&P 500. It is not the average for whatever dodgy thing hosted out of the United Arab Emirates is letting you get to Netflix in the UK from your American address.
Yeah, well, and even if you paid for your life subscription 2 years ago, if the company got sold, then the new people might decide, yeah, no. Or even the current people might decide, yeah, no. It doesn't have to be 20 years ago for that. I've seen lots of places with the same idea of buy a VPS for a lifetime subscription for this much money. And then after a couple of years, they're like, yeah, it turns out electricity costs money every month. So pay up again or we're turning your VPS off and so on. So sometimes a lifetime subscription works out for a value of a lifetime. I bought one for an MMO and got enough years out of it to be happy with that. And, I bought a Plex Pass lifetime, and I bought that enough years ago that it's worked out, and they haven't asked for more money yet, but I definitely am not counting on them not asking for more money real soon now.
Yeah, as with anything, you've got to look at the business model, haven't you?
Yeah, and bandwidth costs money every month. Keeping a VPN working costs money every month.
Yeah, and if someone is doing a lifetime deal on anything, then that means they need a cash infusion for some reason. And that generally isn't a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
Well, eventually that cash infusion is going to run out regardless. You do the lifetime subscription thing so that you can get as much money as you can right now. And there are any number of reasons that you might want to get as much money as you can right now rather than stringing out. It's also possible that you might think, well, these folks might not want my service for more than a year or so, but if I can get them to go ahead and pay for the lifetime whatever, I might only have to serve them for a year, whereas they'd pay me what it might cost them to have been here for 5. That's also valid. It also happens that way, but it just still comes down to nothing is forever. And it's certainly not forever when it only costs you, a couple of $100 to begin with. And like I said, it's a couple of $100 that you're giving to some company being run out of the United Arab Emirates so that you could watch TV that you weren't supposed to be watching.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Quentin writes, one of the servers in my home lab doesn't really have room for any internal hard drives beyond its own SSDs, so I need to put them in an external enclosure. My main Z pool is therefore a 4-drive JBOD box connected over USB 3.1. I was very nervous about using USB for this kind of thing, but so far it has worked surprisingly well. And of course, USB 3 provides plenty of throughput for mirrored spinning Rust drives. I wondered though, if you were doing something similar, what you would use for connecting an external drive enclosure. eSATA, SAS, FireWire? I do have a couple of PCIe slots available, so could use other connections, but it's hard to find JBOD enclosures with anything other than USB, unless they're really a full PC case, and I'm trying to avoid building PCs. Am I being foolish trying to set up a server this way? Any advice is most welcome. P.S. The actual machine is an HP ProDesk 400 G7 small form factor with a 10th gen i7.
So first of all, if I needed external connectivity on drives that are going to be connected all the time, they would either be eSATA or SCSI.
Wow. You mean SAS, right?
Sure, or SAS.
Nothing's been SCSI in 15 years, right?
Well, that kind of depends, but It doesn't matter.
Okay.
The point is, I do not recommend using USB for full-time connected drives. Neither does Alan, and it's not an issue of throughput. It's an issue of whether the protocol was really designed for that, and it was not. Interruptions in USB-connected drives are frequent, and they are not well-trapped or well-handled and can bring your entire system down. eSATA is it's just SATA in a slightly beefed up physical form factor for moving from one box to another. The only real issue becomes one of, how you power the drives. And honestly, that's going to be an issue regardless of whether you're talking USB or, SATA, SAS, SCSI, whatever. You got to power them. And that tends to be what pushes you toward that, full-size PC case that you don't want to get into because you don't want to build machines. You do have other options there. You can absolutely buy cheap little, single drive power supplies that's like just enough power coming off of the wall wart to, power a drive. You can buy those things off of Amazon and you can have your desktop, looking like an Octopodian nightmare if you prefer, but a case is probably a better idea. Your actual system sounds like a great one other than the number of drive bays. 10th gen Intel, great. That particular build, it's going to be very low power utilization. I can see why that's so attractive. You probably were able to get that device relatively cheaply. All very attractive. But now you want to push it into a thing that it can't really do quite so well. I probably would not be looking for a JBOD chassis so much as, and again, this is not the answer you want. I would be looking at building a PC. I would be beginning with the chassis if I'm building an AS. And the very first thing I would be selecting it for is, does it have enough bays for all the drives I want to put in it? And preferably, are those bays accessible without having to crack open the case and, turn the whole system off to get at them? And then everything else kind of comes from there. Now, unfortunately, that, starting out with a Hewlett-Packard motherboard, that motherboard is probably not going to fit very well in any other case because it's a proprietary design designed for proprietary case. It's not standardized like, just some off-the-shelf thing you'd buy from ASRock or Asus or Gigabyte or what have you. So this is a real long-winded way of saying I don't think I have an answer that you want.
Well, can I chip in with a sort of half answer? And that is that instead of getting the SFF small form factor, what you should have done was look for an MT mini tower. That's what I did. Mine's a couple of generations older, but it's an HP box that's relatively similar to this one. But instead of the small form factor, it's mini tower, which means you can put two 3.5-inch discs in there as well as the SSD. And 2 might not be enough for what you want, but it was enough for my on-site backup box, for example.
Yeah, that's perfectly valid. And it's still an example of what I was talking about, which is, you start out, if what you want to do is provide storage, you really have to start with the infrastructure that you need. Do I have enough bays? And you don't have to have hot swap. Joe certainly doesn't in his mini tower version of essentially the same box from a couple of generations earlier. And if you're okay with that, you're okay with that. I'm going to try to talk you out of it. Hot swap is handy. Like the more of this that you do like for a living or just all the time or the total number of drives you have to manage, you start changing your opinion from, what kind of a toss or waste an extra, $300 on hot swap capability for the drives and you can just turn it off and unplug them and take them out to, hell yeah, I want to spend $300 not to have to deal with all that. I want it to be easy and, I not have to sweat whenever it happens. Like I said, though, if this is a one-off, if this is like, your one machine at your house, you're probably not expecting to deal with a failure all that frequently. You probably are willing to tolerate a little bit of downtime to bring the whole box down and figure out which drive and deal with it. So giving up hot swap might make perfect sense. Now, if you do give up hot swap, the one thing you don't want to give up is easy identification of which drive is which without having to disassemble everything and pull it apart. So do yourself a favor. If you have a non-hot swap case, open up the case, whatever part of the drives you can see, which is usually like the butt end of them, where the data and the power connection goes in, or maybe you have, a way to see the other side of it, the blank front plate, but whatever. Point is, on each drive, put a label with the last 4 digits of the WWN ID of the drive right there where you can see it the second you take the panel off the case, before you even turn the machine off. If you do that, then just that alone decreases so much of that ice cold sweat dripping down your neck factor when like a drive has died and you suddenly realize you have no way to be sure which drive it was without like, doing weird stuff like using DD to blip things and watch to try to see which drive lights up or something. Nobody wants to have to do that. Label your drives, even if you don't have hot swap. Other than that, yeah, mini tower might be great.
Yeah, so labeling the drives, I definitely second that. Sometimes, when a drive dies, you don't know the serial number of the drive that died, but you do know the serial number of all the remaining drives. So process of elimination tells you that's the one that's dead, and I can, with surety, pull the right one and know that I've done the right thing. So my first thought when I hear JBOD is, a rack mount case that all my JBODs are. And so that's probably overkill in this case. But you mentioned FireWire, but I don't know that FireWire's actually been that big of a thing in quite a few years. There's some hardware still made for that, mostly because so many people in the media and entertainment space use Macs, and Macs were big on FireWire for a long time. Were. I don't think that's really a direction to go at all. Like, FireWire is a very big dead end. And I think even eSATA, I'm not sure I've seen a lot of new eSATA stuff in like 10 years now. And so that leaves SAS. And so, yeah, you can get like an LSI external HBA. You can get some of the older models like the 3G and 12G ones for not a lot of money. And then from a recycler, often you can get a 2U 12 bay enclosure that's specifically a JBOD and will just have the port at the back that you just run a cable between that chassis and your HBA, and suddenly your little Intel box has all these hard drives connected to it. Although your little small form factor machine connected to a giant 2U thing might be kind of ridiculous in your home lab, especially knowing how loud the JBOD might be, because it's going to try to keep a lot of airflow over all of those hard drives, because it kind of assumes it's in a rack full of other machines blasting out heat and that you don't want to overheat the hard drives. Instantly, Serve the Home, which if you're any kind of home labber is a website you should check out frequently, actually has a little do-it-yourself, build your own JBOD. And they basically bought a cheap Roseville case and a couple of parts and put a SAS expander in it and basically built their own JBOD out of the cheapest PC case they could find for a couple $100, which has the benefit over buying a regular like server class JBOD of not having giant noisy fans that are designed to move air in a data center rather than be quiet in your basement.
However, it's still a lot of faffing about. I mean, even performance-wise, you're making some sacrifices there. If you go the Serve the Helm route, you've got all your drives on the wrong end of a SAS expander, which means one SAS channel rather than a single SAS channel per drive. So you have a lower maximum, throughput for your total number of drives. It's just more to keep up with. It's more of a pain in the butt. For a simple home lab approach, the kind where you started out with a small form factor PC, you almost certainly just want to get one box that can hold all your drives. If you do get into the considering building a PC rather than just, finding something used, in which case, like Joe's example of you just find the MT build rather than the SFF build, of your exact HP would be fine. If you do want to maybe think about building something, but you still kind of want to keep things less enterprisey and rack mounty and more just kind of ad hoc, I can stick this on a table or a shelf. There is one company, Silverstone, that makes inexpensive 8-bay hot swap chassis for they're maybe I want to say they're $300 last I checked, versus $120 for a typical PC case. But you get 8 bays. They're all hot swap. There's a door that closes over all the hot swap trays if you don't want to see the bare trays all the time. The trays themselves, honestly, they're a little plasticky and naff. I don't love using them in client sites. But they're good enough that when a client really strongly favors a mid-tower form factor over rack mount, I have used them many times and I haven't yet had an actual issue. I just, I come from more of a world of, steel construction trays, and the all plastic stuff just, it kind of feels a little dubious to me. But like I said, at this point, I have several machine years of experience with these things and I haven't had a problem.
Meanwhile, my 8th gen HP box was £80 off eBay. And I also got an Octoplex 4th gen i3 for £20 off eBay. So if you want to go super budget, the options are there.
Particularly if you want to go super budget with only a couple of drives. It gets more difficult if you want to put 4 drives in, and it gets essentially impossible if you want to put in, like 6 or 8 drives. Like you're going to need a fairly serious build at that point. It's going to be harder to just get something completely random and cheap that there's loads and loads of on eBay and, Amazon's marketplace and all that good stuff.
I got lucky there with a tower that had enough, basically the 5.25-inch like CD-ROM drive bays that I could fit 2 of the adapters off Amazon to have 8 hot swap bays in the front of it. It had a separate SATA port for each drive, so there's no expander involved, and I just took a normal like Molex 4-pin connector to provide power to the fan that was at the back of the hot swap cage and the 4 drives.
I will warn folks to be careful with those. That is absolutely an approach that you can take, but you better be careful about the quality of those hot swap cages that you can put into those full-size bays. Most of them are garbage. In particular, the company that seems to dominate that space is called IcyDock, and I have used quite a few of their products, and I have been failed by all of them within a few years. Currently, these days, I'm a big fan of Rosewill's hot swap cages.
That's the ones I bought.
The very same hot swap cages that they put factory mounted in their 12-bay 4U servers. You can buy just the cage because that actually is what it is. They have a 12U chassis they have a 4U chassis that one of the options for it is sticking in 3 of their 4-drive hot swap cages. But you can buy just that cage and you can put it in any case that has, 3 contiguous 5.25 bays. You can just slide it right on in. It's good to go. I've built a lot of machines with Corsair cases and one of those 4-bay cages that way.
Michael writes, Alan was talking about an SSH key management solution in episode 235 on the FreeBSD cluster, where users authenticate against LDAP and get their SSH keys copied to the target system. Could you give some more details on the setup and configuration?
Yeah, so in SSHD, there's a configuration option called Authorize Keys Command, which basically, instead of looking in each user's home directory for, .sh/authorize keys, it will run a command with some parameters, and that will return a list of authorized keys. And so with that, you can basically use something like LDAP search to say, look for this username in LDAP and get this property, which will contain a list of the SSH keys for that user. And this, if set up with your LDAP, would mean that you can have kind of single sign-on, and that if you disable a user, they'll stop being able to log into every box. And if you add a new person to your team, then they would automatically have access to all the machines. In a follow-up, Michael also asked about how to make this specific to different classes of machine. So, maybe you want users to have access to 20 of the 100 machines, but not all 100 and so on. And mostly that comes down to either roles or groups and organizational units and so on in LDAP. And so you kind of just construct your LDAP search command to search for the types of thing you want to search for that server. If you want something more advanced like that, I'd recommend Michael Lucas's book, SSH Mastery, which has great recipes for some of the more complicated cases you might go with. But that's how the FreeBSD cluster does it, is basically we have LDAP to manage all the users instead of putting each user in the password file locally, and then using this authorize keys command with a little script that searches our LDAP for the specific set of rules that will only match if you're allowed to log into this box, and then it'll pull your list of public keys out of our LDAP thing. And there's Kerberos mixed in there and some other stuff, but we even have a service that allows users to self-serve updating their SSH keys. So if you have one of your keys that works, you can SSH to a specific host, and when you log in, you can update the list of keys and control which keys are there and be able to add your new key, remove your old keys, and so on. Which sure beat the old way of send a GPG signed email to the accounts team, which I imagine is exactly what Michael's trying to avoid at his organization, of having to manually manage the SSH keys for all these users, especially people that aren't used to using SSH keys and are going to very quickly move to a different machine and forget to bring their SSH key with them or something like that.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.